Can you see my screen share again? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So
Yes.
start to look at the metrics in a little bit more detail. So we've got some basic metrics where you're looking at each session individually, and we've got some advanced metrics, which again you may only get. I didn't check, but I think you might only get these with some of these with the premium accounts. With the metrics I'm going to talk about first, they can be used session to session and day to day, but we often look at these over a more longer time period. We're looking at trends in the training history really, and how things are progressing over time. So these metrics are specific to Training Peaks, if you like. They're sort of trademarked by Training Peaks. So if you haven't used it before, you won't probably have come across these metrics before. On the right-hand side, the image that I've put on is, again, just a snapshot of the calendar. On the right-hand side of the calendar that we looked at a moment ago, there's a summary of what this athlete's been doing. Again, if it's taken at the end of a week, the numbers are all quite big. If it's on the Monday, then the numbers won't quite be so big. If you look at each of the little schematic drawings that you've got there, looking at the total duration and the TSS and the swim, etc., down to bike and run and strength, the lighter grey number is what's been prescribed for the week. So you'll have that number if you're following a plan or you've put in your own plan. And it will look at what you should be doing for that week. The darker number at the end is what you've actually done training that week up to that point. So again, this is on a Sunday. You can see that's nearly 15 hours total training. Total sort of training stress score of 978. Swim was almost 3 hours. Swim distance was about 11k. Bike was about 7.5 hours. Run 4.5 hours. And I think I was too tired that week to do any strength. So that was that week done. So that's a summary. It gives us a brief idea of what sort of volume of training has been done. And across the top in the blue, the pink and the yellow, we've got another 3 metrics which are based on the TSS, which are your fitness, which is CTL, your fatigue, which is ATL, and your form, which is TSB. So again, this is where it starts to get a bit complicated, but I'll try to keep it fairly simple. So training stress score, this is at the heart of these metrics. So training stress score is basically an algorithm or a calculation that's done on the intensity of your session versus the duration of that same session. So the baseline or the gold sort of standard for this is a score of 100 would be if you rode your bike at 100% of your FTP, your threshold power, for 1 hour. So 1 hour at FTP gives you a score of 100. Obviously, if you do it as 3 blocks of 20 and a few rest periods in between, you're going to get a bit more than 100 because you've got the rest periods to add on as well. It will do the same with pace if you're running, and it will do the same with heart rate. So if you don't have a power meter on the bike, but you've got your heart rate strap on, because it knows what your heart rate zones are, and it knows what your threshold heart rate is, as we put in on the settings, it will then give you a number based on heart rate TSS. So you can get pace-based TSS for swim and for running. You can get power-based TSS for biking, and you can get heart rate TSS for all 3 of them if that's the metric that you're choosing to track. So if you use power meter maybe on the turbo trainer, but when you ride at the weekend, you go out for 2 or 3 hours and you're not using a power meter, but you've got your heart rate belt on, it will still give you a TSS score based on your heart rate threshold that you've set in. So again, if any of those metrics are not right, then unfortunately, your results at this point are not going to be right either. So that's training stress score. So it's a way of trying to give you an idea of how hard you've worked, and it will make the sessions seem more comparable to each other, and then it will build day on day. So if you did a bike in the morning for 50 TSS and you do a swim in the evening for 50 TSS, obviously your daily total is 100, and that's sort of then building through the week, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail now. So fitness is your chronic training load, that's CTL, so that's how fit you are. Your fatigue, so how tired you are, is the acute training load. So that's the training load that's over a shorter period of time, because that would make you very tired. But the longer duration of training that you've done, the longer sort of consistent training, that should build your fitness. So that's the CTL, what you've done chronically. And then the form is basically the balance between the two. So if we get that right, we feel fresh and we're ready to race or ready to perform well, hopefully. And they're all based on your TSS scores. So moving on from that. So your TSS, as I say, we can calculate per day based on us triathletes wanting quite often to do more than one session. So on the acute side of things, this is how tired you are from your training. And it's an average of the score for the last 7 days. So the TSS for the last 7 days is your ATL. So on the top picture again, that's the middle one, the pink one. So that's on that it's 134. And that would say, well, that's 134 is quite high. So yeah, that's pretty tiring week, I have to say. Now, the chronic training load, which produces your fitness, is basically is reflecting the consistent training that you've done. So this is the average of your stress scores for the last 42 days, which if my maths are right, 6 sevens were 42, I think, when I was at school. So we've got, as people often think, you know, the training that you're doing now is really going to be benefiting you in 6 weeks' time. That's when the body has had a chance to adapt and to develop. And so it's this score, the CTL, that we often want to track most closely as coaches. And we want to see it going up and up, ideally to an ideal sort of level before a race. And then we would bring it back down a little to allow the form, the final one, the yellow one, to come up a little bit just before race day, so that we've built the fitness over the weeks and weeks and weeks that we're preparing. And then we start to taper off that period that everybody hates. But as we're doing so, that training stress balance would start to come up and we'd feel hopefully fresher and more ready to race. So here the CTL was 119. So you can see the chronic training load over 6 weeks was a bit lower than that week's training, which was 134. So it's a negative balance at that point. Okay, so you're certainly not fresh and ready to race, but it's not too bad that it's fairly average. And then the freshness, this form, or the way we're actually feeling and ready, hopefully ready to race, compares that acute to the chronic. So if we're too high, so if that number where it's minus 19 at the top, if that was very, very high, let's say plus 40, which as you can see on the rings on the right-hand side of the bottom image is really quite high, that would probably suggest we're undertrained, that we're too fresh, we're too ready to go, but it might not mean we've got anything there to go with. We might have no fitness that's built up. So that's the problem with going too high at that level. If we go too deep, and we fatigue ourselves too much, we build too much volume, too much fatigue, then we would go lower and lower into the minus numbers. So if this week was really, really massively harder than every week you've done for the last 4 or 5, we would get that really high minus number. And again, according to the guys who set up this system in Training Peaks, anything certainly under the minus 30 is overreaching or overtraining. That's when we're likely to cause ourselves issues. As you can see on the graph at the bottom, these lines don't appear on your graph actually that you get in Training Peaks, but you can see round about the minus 20 is kind of optimal. So it means that we're ramping the training up. It is harder than the weeks before, but it's not stupidly harder. We've not suddenly dropped in a massive amount of training. Now, again, I wouldn't say this is basic Training Peaks. This is the sort of stuff that we would look at as coaches largely when we're building athletes towards key events. But if you're so inclined, you can certainly go read a little bit more about this and start to look into how to plan your own training in this way. And again, this is stuff that you can't do on a lot of other platforms, and you certainly can't do on the social media platforms. And so, again, you get this performance management chart, which is the one in the top left. This was for the last 3 months, I think. So again, I'll go into that in a bit more detail. But what I've done is, this is my performance management chart for the last 2 years. So the color coding is exactly the same. So where we had the acute training load in pink and the chronic training load in blue, they're still pink and blue on this. So the blue, which looks like the mountain range at the back, that is your chronic training load. So as I said, this is what we want to build, particularly if we're looking at middle and longer distance events. We want that huge volume of aerobic training, and that's really what that reflects. The yellow lines are the the training stress balance. So if the yellow line is going down, we're getting fresher, ready to race. If the yellow line is going up, sorry, the other way around. If it's going down, we're getting more tired and fatigued in the short term. And if the yellow line is coming up as we come to race, we should be feeling fresher and fitter and ready to go. So if you take a look more at the red dots, which are near the bottom, this is the training stress score per day. So again, this isn't just per session. If you do 2 or 3 sessions in one day, this is the training stress score. And the key on the left tells us how much we're gaining. So we've got 100 in red, and then 200, 300, 400. So you can see most of the red dots are grouped towards the bottom of the chart. So they're sort of between, I don't know, let's say 60, 70 TSS and 150 or something like that. So an average day for this athlete, well, for me, it looks like it's in that sort of bracket. If the red dots are right on the bottom, then they are rest days. So if they're lying on the bottom of the screen, that's where you've accumulated no TSS during that day. And that's why the dot's on the bottom. So they're the lazy days or the recovery days. Now, if you look at the trends of the blue line at the back, which is the easier one to focus because it's filled in solid blue, you can see here from December of 2018, building up, the training ramps up massively, and I was being coached by Chris Standage then and building towards some Ironman goals myself. And then you can see I don't know if I can show you actually, the red dots. No, wait. The red dots that are much higher up on the chart. So one that's above the 6th of the 8th, 2019, there's a red dot that's in the pink line. That's Ironman Lanzarote. So you can see, that's really quite high, and that's an outlier. That's a race. You can see immediately that it was something out of the ordinary. The next one up is Ironman UK. And the one that's right up on the top of the chart is Hawaii, is Kona, where I didn't race particularly well, but you can see the stress on my body was absolutely massive on that day, looking at that outlier. So those are there for a reason, but they're not the norm, are they? They're totally way up off the top of the charts. And then if you follow the blue line, so if you can see here that I really build up a lot of training time and volume for that first Ironman in Lanzarote. The blue line then starts to drop down and then peaks a little bit again for UK, but nowhere as big as the original peak. And again, the 2 races at Ironman were only 6 weeks apart, so it just wasn't possible to recover and then massively build again. So there was only a little peak for that. Did well there, and then you can see kind of motivation drops, training time drops because I'd reached the goal that I wanted.
What? Why is it on Prime tonight? Dad wants to know.
Football.
Prime. So, by a certain amount, don't they? Who wants to know, Dad?
Slates, can we go on mute? So that was the peak and the trough there. Then obviously after doing Hawaii, really a lot of layoff, and it hits the lowest point really up until sort of the December of that year. And then, you decide to get your act back in gear, and this ramp then comes back up. And that's what we can see here through the rest of the year. So that's the trend there. Now, again, that's something that it's useful to look at trends over time. You can look at where you performed well in the past. You can look to see if you can maybe replicate that in the future. And certainly if there's things that went wrong, you might look to these metrics to say, was I overtrained? Was I too tired? Had I ramped up things too much? Again, so as a coach, it's a great tool. As an athlete, you'd need to be well invested to start looking into this data. But what you probably will look at a bit more is just the basic workout analysis. So with every workout that you do, you get the figures, for example, the ones that I've screenshot on the left-hand side. So this would have been a bike workout. It was just over 2 hours long. We got 68 kilometers in. Again, knowing me, it would have been on Zwift as well. And then you get a training stress score of 84 for those 2 hours. So that we've sort of talked about those bits already. Now, with the data below that, some of those numbers are quite important, and I'll just tap into a couple of those numbers before we finish. So, as an example, if we got this was a sweat test that I did, which was 5 hours in the garage on Zwift, set at Ironman power, which was 70% of FTP. And then we did some sweat collection, and we looked at salt loss, and we did some hydration stuff. So it was kind of an experiment as well as a training session. You can see that it was 5 hours and 6. It was 153k or just over 90 odd miles, and it generated 242 training stress score. Again, we've got the caption on the right to look at the data, and we've also got the graph to look at, which you get for all of your workouts. So just to explain the graph briefly, at the back we've got the gradient. So again, this is the course on Zwift that we can see. And then the main metrics to focus on is the pink, which is the power now. So you can see that it was very flat because this was done on erg mode. So this was done set at 70% of FTP. I think it was 250 watts exactly. And you can see it doesn't really vary from that, except every hour it drops massively for the 60 seconds it took me to go and weigh myself again and put my kit back on and get back on the bike. So that's the drop-offs that you see in the power. Now, the yellow is the cadence. So you can see for the first hour, cadence doesn't vary that much. For the second hour, every time that cadence drops like a little spike, I think that is me standing from the saddle. So getting more uncomfortable probably. And then the third hour, there's more of those drops. Now, I'm not losing power, again, because the turbo's holding that, but I'm dropping my cadence. And again, I expect these are breaks where I'm relieving my undercarriage and having a stand. And I think it's really quite remarkable how the last hour, if that is the case, my cadence has dropped overall. So the top peaks of the yellow line are much lower than they were in the first hour. So I've definitely dropped my cadence from probably around 90 to about 80, looking at the yellow key on the right-hand side. And then the drops are much more frequent. So I'm obviously not holding any sort of decent position on the bike. I'm just trying to get through the session. And then the red line is the heart rate value. Now, as you can see, as is typical with these long endurance sessions, it starts out reasonably low. It's well below the pink power line, and it gradually creeps up and up and up. Now, it doesn't get to anything silly. It's only getting to about 150 or so at the end. This is an endurance ride, but you can see that trend is just creeping up and up. So just by looking at the graph, it gives you a rough idea. You've not got any specifics, but you can take quite a bit away from just looking at the graphs. Now, if we go into it a little bit more detail, you get these metrics. So on the right here at the top, we've got normalized power, NP. We've got IF, which is intensity factor. And we've got VI, which is variability index. We've got some things there, which I'll explain now in a bit more detail. So normalized power, for those that haven't used power on the bike too often, is the average power, which would be AP, but it takes into account the effects of the peaks and troughs. So really it reflects how the ride would really feel to somebody. So if you just did a mathematical calculation based on an average power, it will give you average power. But if you actually sink in the way that would feel in the body, and it probably needs some clever algorithms to do it, it will actually give you a normalized power, which is more like what it would feel like. So if you think about the two examples there, if you rode an hour at 200 watts flat, your average power and your normalized power would be exactly the same. And it would feel like that no matter which data you use. 200 watts feels like 200 watts. But if you did it as 20 minutes at 100, 20 minutes at 200, and then built to 20 minutes at 300, that session would actually feel quite a lot harder. And in that case, although your average would still be 200, your normalized actually would be 240. So that would reflect how much harder that latter session felt to you. So most people, when they talk about power on a bike, they're talking about normalized power these days. So that's what normalized power means in your training peaks metrics. Intensity factor, IF, is a very important one, I think. And basically it's your output. So it's your NP, it's that power above, it's the power you actually did versus what your threshold power is. So if you ride 200 watts, which is your threshold, and you ride it for a full hour, then that's 100% of your threshold. So you get a score of 1.0. So they've just changed percentages to decimals here. So if you ride an endurance ride at 70% of FTP, you would get a score of 0.7. And that's exactly what I rode the Ironman one at. The explanation was just about above. So if you have a variable ride again, the normalized power, the NP actually accounts for that. So you don't have to be riding a dead flat level time trial course to use this data. If you ride up and down hills all day, normalized power will take that into account, and it will still give you a value based on your threshold power, which again will be under 1.0. You can't get above 1.0 because you can't ride more than an hour at your threshold because it wouldn't be your threshold. Okay, so that's IF. So that's really quite an important one. And then the variability index, not quite as important, but this is looking at how much your power varies within a ride. So it's the difference really between that normalized power that we said and the average power. So the reason that this is quite important is we don't want much variation. If we want to pace things nice and well and smoothly over the course of a race, particularly if it's quite a flat course that we're racing, we really don't want any variation in our effort level. We want to start moderately hard and stay moderately hard right through to the finish. So if there was no variation at all in the course, if we did 200 watts right the way from start to finish, we would get a 1.00. So there's no variation. The goal here really is to keep it less than 1.05, unless it's a really demanding course. Like Ironman UK, probably be difficult to keep it under 1.05. And if you're doing something like mountain biking or road racing on your bike or criterium racing, we're not looking at smooth, even power output. What I'm talking about here is more the time trialing or the triathlon mentality, where we want to dose our efforts over a certain time period as best we can. So that's where we use that metric quite well. And then the final one that's quite useful is our efficiency factor. So efficiency factor basically is a posh way of saying how much power or pace do we get for each heartbeat. So if you think the heart beats, it pushes the blood around the body. And if we get 200 watts out of every 50 heartbeats, that would give us a ratio, let's say. So that's what it uses for efficiency factor. So that's quite good, because you could look at that over time and see that you might not be gaining more power, but at the same power, your heart rate might be lower. So you're becoming more efficient. So that's quite a nice way for people who are doing longer distance races, or to look at those weekend rides where you're not smashing any new power bests or heart rate bests, but actually your body might be doing a lot better underneath. And so that would show you whether it is performing better on an easy ride or an endurance ride. And then the decoupling bit is if that changes over the course of the ride. So when I showed you just there, if I just scroll back, my heart rate rising there, if you look at the power to heart rate, it says 5.96%. That means there's roughly a 6% increase in my heart rate for that same power, because we kept the power the same all the way through. Now that's just on the verge of being a little too high. So again, as far as that metric's concerned, we like to keep the decoupling at less than 5%. So again, you can monitor that. If I'd have dropped by 10 watts to 240 and rode 5 hours, I might have found that it was well within the 5%. So at that time that I did the 5-hour test, it was probably just a touch too hard towards the end, particularly. If I'd have stopped it at 4 hours, again, I might have been within the 5%. Now that's just telling me that if I aim to ride that power in a race, I could really do with just building my endurance a little more to help bring that number down. So that's how I would use that metric. So what if you want to look at a big gear session? Here, if we're looking at this, it's the intervals that matter. What we've looked at just there was the whole ride, the whole effort. So here you can see there's a warm-up, there's a few spikes of effort to really prepare the rider for the efforts. And then the blue blocks is the prescription. That's the workout builder saying this is what we should have done. So that's the power. Now you can see the pink again, or the purple in this case, because it's hidden on the blue. They hit the right power on rep 1. But from there on, unfortunately, they just, things really look like they got worse and worse. And rep 11 or what it is right next to the end, well, it looks like it was really difficult to do. The yellow lines are the cadence. So again, we can see that when the intervals were performed, cadence was, I don't know what the scale is, but cadence was down low. And then in the middle, it got really, really low, which was probably too much. And on the 11th one, where the yellow comes right down to the very bottom, it's likely that the cadence of the turbo trainer probably got on top of them and they almost stopped. And that's why the power dropped very, very low. So we can analyze the data, for the intervals, and look at it step by step. And that's obviously more important for the interval sessions than the overall results. If we look at that, just to explain that a little bit more, if we look at a sweet spot session, this was 3 lots of 18 minutes. We can clearly see in the graph in the middle that we've got heart rate rising in 3 obvious blocks of effort with the power up there in a fairly straight line. So we can see what's been going on. But again, what we might want to do is not analyze the whole session, because if we look at heart rate in red and power there in the purple graph, we've got a bit of everything, because it's including the rest periods, the warm up, the cool down. So that doesn't tell us that much. But if we look at those 3 18-minute blocks on their own, which I've highlighted in blue, we can see that the effort level was between 85% or 0.85 0.84 there is actually in the middle, 0.87 at the top. So we've got tempo maybe to the lower end of sweet spot. So it was described as sweet spot, but not quite hit it. The power, we've got the normalized and the average. Again, this was very close because it's just a basic effort on a Zwift session. So we've got 300 to 310 basically. And then over on the far side, we can see what the heart rate's doing with the average heart rate for each interval. So what's interesting is we've got an average heart rate of 159, climbs to 162, and then stays at 162 for the three intervals. And then we've got the cadence on the very far side. So again, a bit like the trend I said before, first interval was hit at 88 revs per minute, second one a little bit lower at 85, third one lower again at 81. So this is a common trend that people often start off at a relatively high cadence, and as fatigue sets in, we tend to use bigger and bigger motor units in our muscles and use a bigger gear. So we're essentially going to our legs and not using the heart and lungs quite so much. And that's a common trend. Now we can see that from looking at that data, but we wouldn't have seen that by looking at the whole session to begin with. And then another example, this is the last one, just to show you from a run. I've put this in as well because this is the data that you get from the mobile app. So you can look at this on your phone. You have to be very, very careful about analysing it on a phone because the metrics, as far as the graphs representing the workouts, are not very accurate. So this is just a simple run. It was an endurance pace run with 4 hill efforts up Teletubby Hill. So again, this is my data. You can see it's generally a zone 2 run. But then interestingly, the green line actually drops really quite low when I'm doing the most intense part of the workout. My heart rate as well, the red line, drops a little bit during the most intense part of the workout, as does the cadence. So the hill efforts, the 4 of them, on the graph at first instance are not actually representing what they were. They were the real quality bit of the session. But actually all the metrics look like they went down. So you would presume at first glance, oh, that was the easy bit. That was the rest period. But in fact, it wasn't. That was the sprints up the hill. When we look into that one in a bit more detail, you can see that the blue graph here, we've got the pace zone. So I certainly stayed in endurance in zone 2 for the majority of the run. But as far as my heart rate's concerned, I was still in zone 2 for a lot of it, but my heart rate either drifted to zone 3 or the spikes of intensity pushed it to zone 3. But the other thing I just wanted to mention is that the heart rate zones, the pace zones, the power zones, they don't all line up perfectly. So it's quite common to be in zone 2 pace or power and be in zone 3 heart rate. Your zones are your zones. You'll get used to them, but don't expect them to line up exactly every time that you do sessions. It just doesn't happen, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. So, well done. You've got to the end of that. Hopefully, that has given you a good start as to how to use Training Peaks, get all your data and start to use it. Don't be afraid of it. There's lots of help online. Training Peaks have got umpteen articles and videos and things for you to follow, so it isn't too difficult at all. Does anybody have any questions on any of that before we wrap it up?
He said it's nice to have work to go and do, but it can be tough not seeing.
If you do have any questions that you'd like to ask personally or afterwards, my email's at the top. It's just phil.ellison@Total Tri Training. Or you can have a look at the coaching website, and my coaching profile's on there if you want to have a look. Some of the other things produced with regards videos, some articles, it's all accessible there on the Total Tri website. So you're welcome to have a look at that as well. If there's no questions, we'll wrap it up and let you go on with your evening.
Thanks. First time I've really understood the fitness, fatigue and form bit, I must admit. So that was really well explained. So
well, good at the start.
Right,
to start.
but that was pretty good, thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay. No worries, no worries.
Thanks, Phil.
Okay, mate, no worries at all. No worries.